I met my wife when I was 32 and she was 28. She was the kind of woman who walked into a room and made everyone else feel like they'd been standing in a waiting area their whole lives. Sharp, driven, the kind of ambition that made you proud just being near it. Her name was Diane, and for 11 years, I thought I was the luckiest man in the state of Ohio. We met at a mutual friend's barbecue in Columbus. She was arguing with someone about interest rates, and I remember thinking, who argues about interest rates at a cookout? She was right, by the way. She was almost always right about things like that. I walked over, agreed with her point, and she looked at me like I'd passed some kind of test she hadn't told me I was taking. We exchanged numbers. She texted first. That detail mattered to me then. It doesn't anymore. We got married 4 years later in a small ceremony outside Cincinnati. My parents were there. Her mother flew in from Phoenix. We wrote our own vows. Mine were too long, and I stumbled over the last line because I was nervous, and she laughed, not at me, with me, and squeezed my hand to steady me. That was the Diane I married. I want you to hold on to that version of her, because the story I'm about to tell you is going to make it hard to remember she ever existed. We had 2 kids. Owen was 8 when everything fell apart, and our daughter Claire was 6. They were good kids, the kind of kids who still believed their parents had answers to everything. Owen used to come into the kitchen on Saturday mornings and ask me questions I couldn't possibly know. Why is the sky a different blue in winter, Dad? Does the sun get tired? I never had the right answers, but I always tried, and he always seemed satisfied. Claire was quieter, more watchful. She noticed things. I didn't understand how much she'd been noticing until much later. My wife worked in commercial real estate. Not selling houses, the big stuff. Negotiating leases for corporate offices, retail chains, development deals that sometimes ran into 8 figures. She was exceptional at it. Over the years, she climbed steadily, and by the time this story begins, she was a senior director at a mid-sized firm called Away Group, based downtown. I worked in civil engineering, mostly municipal infrastructure contracts. Steady work, good money, not glamorous. We were comfortable. 2 cars, a house in Westerville with a yard big enough that Owen could throw a baseball without hitting a fence. We weren't rich, but we had built something real, or so I believed. The first thing I noticed was the phone. Not that she was on it more than usual. She had always been glued to it for work. What changed was how she held it. A small thing, almost embarrassing to admit I noticed. She started angling the screen away from me when she was typing, a slight rotation of the wrist, almost unconscious. The first time I saw it, I told myself I was imagining things. The second time I noted it and said nothing. By the 5th or 6th time, something in me had quietly filed it away. Then there were the evening events. Diane had always attended work functions. It was part of her job, smoozing developers and investors over dinner. But the frequency changed. Where it used to be once or twice a month, it became weekly, sometimes twice a week. She'd come home late, a little flushed, telling me about deals in progress, new clients, the usual language of her world. I had no reason to doubt her. I still did all the right things. Kept dinner warm, put the kids to bed, asked about her night. She'd give me a summary that sounded rehearsed in a way I couldn't quite name. The marriage wasn't cold. That's what made it so hard to trust my own instincts. We still talked over dinner. We still laughed at the same TV shows. She still reached for my hand sometimes when we were watching something together on the couch. Looking back, I think that normalcy was part of what kept me anchored in denial for as long as I was. I kept measuring things against those moments of warmth and telling myself the math added up. It was a Tuesday in March, when the doubt stopped being something I could talk myself out of. I had come home early from a site visit that got cut short due to weather. The house was quiet. Kids still at school. Diane supposedly in meetings all day. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen island, and that's when I saw her laptop on the counter, screen open. She'd been working from home that morning before heading in. She must have left in a hurry. I wasn't snooping. I want to be honest about that. I walked past it. I poured my coffee. I sat down, but the screen was facing me, and there was a browser tab open, and the preview text visible in the tab showed the name of a messaging application she used for work. It was nothing by itself, but then my eyes moved to a second tab she left open, and the subject line of an email draft was visible in the tab title. Can't stop thinking about last night. I sat there for a long time with my coffee going cold. I am not a man who acts on impulse. I've always been wired to process slowly, to turn things over before I respond. So, I didn't open the laptop. I didn't read the email. I stood up, rinsed my mug, and went to the living room, and I sat in the chair by the window for probably 45 minutes just breathing. Part of me wanted to believe there was an explanation. A work situation with an emotional edge. A message to a girlfriend about a date. Something innocent that had just landed weird in a subject line preview. But I'm an engineer. I work with load-bearing structures for a living. I know the difference between a crack that's cosmetic and a crack that means something underneath has shifted. Something had shifted. I didn't say anything to Diane that night. Or the next night. I needed to be sure before I said anything, because I knew once I opened that door, nothing about our house would look the same. So I paid attention. I paid the kind of attention that's exhausting and heartbreaking, and also, in a terrible way, clarifying. I noticed she'd started taking her phone into the bathroom. Not occasionally, every time. I noticed that when she laughed at something on her phone, she'd turn it face down before she set it on the table. I noticed that twice in 1 week. She mentioned a colleague named Patrick in passing. Casually, the way you mention someone you're trying to make seem ordinary. I noticed she started going to the gym at 6 a.m., 3 times a week, when for the past 3 years she'd always said she hated morning workouts. I started writing things down. Not obsessively, just dates, times, observations. Engineer brain. Document first, interpret later. 3 weeks after I saw that email preview, I had my confirmation. And it didn't come from hacking her phone or hiring anyone or any dramatic maneuver. It came from a moment of pure carelessness on her part. She'd asked me to forward her a document from her personal email, something she needed for a meeting, and had sent herself from another device. She gave me her login credentials without thinking, because we'd shared them for years for things like this. I logged in, found the document, forwarded it, and I want to be clear that I almost closed the window right then. I saw a folder in her inbox she had apparently created and labeled, simply P. There were 47 emails in it. I read enough to understand everything I needed to understand. Patrick Hale was a senior partner at a development firm that did regular business with Callaway Group. He was, based on what I read, separated from his own wife. The emails spanned 8 months. They were not ambiguous. I closed the laptop. I sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes. Then I went inside, made dinner for my kids, helped Owen with a math worksheet, read Claire her bedtime story, and did not say a single word to my wife about what I knew. That was the hardest thing I have ever done in my life, sitting across the dinner table from someone who is lying to you and deliberately choosing, not to reach across and detonate everything. But I had learned from conversations with divorced friends, from things I'd read in quieter moments, that the worst thing a betrayed spouse can do is act before they're ready. Emotion without preparation benefits no one but the person who wronged you. So I prepared. I called my brother Daniel first, because he's a straight talker and because he's the only person in my life I trusted completely. He didn't say much when I told him. He listened. Then he said, "What do you need?" That was it. No lecture, no outrage on my behalf. Just, "What do you need?" That was it. No lecture, no outrage on my behalf. Just, "What do you need?" I told him I need a recommendation for a good attorney. I met with a family law attorney named Susan Greer within the week. She was pragmatic and focused and told me clearly what my options were, what documentation would matter, and, importantly, what the likely outcome of a divorce proceeding would look like given our assets, our income difference, and the children. She told me to be methodical. She told me that what I documented now would matter later. She told me to open a separate bank account, not to move money but to ensure I had independent access to my own income going forward. I did everything she told me. Meanwhile, I kept being a husband. I kept being a father. I drove Owen to baseball practice on Saturdays. I made pancakes on Sunday mornings. I laughed at the right moments. I held the whole thing together from the outside while the inside was doing something I can only describe as going quiet. Not numb, just focused, like the way a structure stabilizes itself under load. Diane, for her part, seemed to grow more comfortable as the weeks went on. I think my lack of accusation read to her as obliviousness. She started staying out later. She stopped offering explanations for her evenings. Once, she came home after midnight, and when I asked, gently, without accusation, how the dinner went, she said, "Fine," and went straight to the bathroom. I lay in bed listening to the shower run and thought about Owen asking me if the son gets tired. The night it all came to a head was not one I planned. Callaway Group was hosting their annual spring client dinner. It was a big deal for Diane. The firm rented out a private room at a restaurant in the short north, and the partners used it to celebrate the year's biggest deals. Diane had been talking about it for weeks. She'd bought a new dress. She'd had her hair done. She was going, she said, to celebrate a deal she'd personally closed that had been the firm's largest contract of the year. She seemed genuinely proud of it, and even through everything, some small part of me recognized that the pride was real. Whatever else she was doing, she was still good at her job. What she didn't know was that a client of mine, a project manager named Gerald I'd worked with on a city contract, was the brother-in-law of one of Callaway Group's partners. Gerald and I had grabbed lunch the previous week and he'd mentioned, offhandedly, that he'd been invited to the spring dinner. He didn't know anything about my situation. He was just making conversation. I asked him, as casually as I could manage, if he'd mind if I stopped by to congratulate Diane in person. Surprised her. He said, of course. He could put me on the guest list as his +1 for the cocktail portion. He thought it was romantic. I'm not proud of how I used that, but I needed to see it for myself. I arrived at the restaurant at 7:40. The cocktail hour was still going. I gave my name at the door, was shown in, and I stood near the entrance and scanned the room. It wasn't hard to find her. Diane was near the far end of the bar, in the blue dress she bought, holding a glass of white wine and laughing at something a man next to her had said. Her hand was resting on his forearm as she laughed. The man was Patrick Hale. I stood there for a moment. I want to describe that moment accurately because people often expect rage, and what I felt was closer to the opposite. A strange, almost physical stillness, like everything had slowed down. I had known for weeks. I had held this knowledge carefully, like something fragile, and here it was, in a room full of her colleagues, in the dress she'd been excited to wear, and there was nothing left to doubt. I walked across the room. She saw me when I was about 10 feet away. I watched her expression travel, surprise, confusion, a flicker of something that looked almost like fear. And then she smiled, the performance kicking in automatically. "What are you doing here?" she said. Warm voice. Like I was a pleasant surprise. "Gerald Marsh is a friend," I said. He mentioned the dinner. Patrick Hale extended his hand. "Patrick, I work with Diane on the development side." His handshake was firm and his eye contact was steady, and he was, I'll give him that, composed. "I know who you are," I said. The sentence sat there. Diane's smile didn't break, but her eyes changed. "Can we talk?" she said. "We can," I said, "but not here." We stepped out to a small hallway near the restrooms. She crossed her arms. I noticed she didn't ask what I meant, didn't say what I meant, didn't say what's going on, didn't perform any confusion. She just looked at me and waited. And in that moment, I understood how thoroughly she had underestimated me. "I know about Patrick," I said. "I know about the emails. I know what's been going on for 8 months. I know you've had dinners, weekends away you told me were work trips, and I know that email draft you left open in March was not a coincidence." She was quiet. Then she said, "How did you—" "It doesn't matter how," I said. "I'm not here to argue tonight. I'm not going to make a scene. I'm going to go home and be with our kids. And tomorrow morning I'm going to ask you to move in with your sister while we figure out next steps. I've spoken to a lawyer." "Dave, my name is Marcus," I said, and I don't know why I said it exactly like that. Except that something in me needed to be fully present in my own name in that moment. "Marcus." She took a breath. "Think about the kids. Think about what this does to them." And there it was. I had been waiting for it, and there it was. "I've been thinking about the kids," I said quietly, "every single day for the last 2 months while I watched you stop thinking about them." I didn't say anything after that. I walked back through the restaurant, nodded to Gerald on my way out, and drove home. The sitter was watching TV in the living room. I paid her, thanked her, locked the front door, and went upstairs. I looked in on Owen. First, he was asleep on his back with his arm thrown over his eyes, the way he always slept. Then I looked in on Claire. She was awake, barely, and she looked up at me in the half-dark. "Dad," she said. "Hey, Bug," I said. "Hey, Bug," I said. "Is Mom coming home tonight?" I sat on the edge of her bed for a moment. Later, yeah. She looked at me with those watchful eyes of hers, and she said, "Are you okay?" 6 years old, and she was asking me that. "I'm going to be," I said. And I meant it. Diane came home at 11. I was in the living room, not waiting. Or not only waiting. I'd been sitting with a glass of water and a quiet house. doing the work of deciding who I was going to be from this point forward. She came in and stood in the doorway, and we looked at each other, and there was nothing left to negotiate in the silence. She slept in the guest room that night. The next morning, after I got the kids to school, I sat down with her at the kitchen table. No yelling, no dishes thrown. I'd been afraid of my own anger for weeks, afraid of what I might say if I let it out, but what I actually felt sitting across from her in the morning light was just tired, truthful, ready. I asked her to tell me the truth, not to justify anything, not to minimize, just the truth. She told me it had started as a professional friendship. She told me she hadn't planned it. She told me that things at home it felt, and here she paused, distant. She told me she knew that was an excuse. She said she was sorry. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, I have never once in 11 years hidden anything from you. Not where I was, not what I was thinking, not what I was struggling with. I was an open book to someone who had a separate folder in her email that she thought I'd never find. She didn't say anything. I need you to leave, I said. Not permanently. We'll figure out custody together and we're going to handle this like adults because of those 2 kids upstairs. But I need you out of this house while we do that. She left that afternoon. She went to her sister Carol's place in Dublin. She took one back. I think she expected me to call her by the end of the week, to soften, to float the idea of counseling. I did speak with the therapist, actually. For myself, not for the marriage. My attorney had recommended it, said it helped clients stay clear-headed during proceedings. She was right. The divorce process took about 10 months. I won't say it was clean, because nothing with that much life tangled up in it is clean, but it was fair. Susan Greer was excellent. Diane's attorney was competent. We settled on shared custody. 1 week on, 1 week off. And the financial terms were straightforward enough given our documentation. I kept the house. It made more sense for the kids to stay in the same school district. I want to tell you about the moment I felt something shift back towards something livable. It wasn't dramatic. It was a Saturday morning in October, about 6 months after Diane had left. Owen was at baseball practice. Claire was sitting at the kitchen counter doing something with crayons. I was making eggs. The radio was on, some old Springsteen song I've always liked. And I was just standing there cooking eggs in my own kitchen on a Saturday morning, and it hit me that the air in the room felt different. Lighter. Not happy exactly, but breathable, like something that had been pressing down had quietly stepped back. Claire looked up from her drawing and held it toward me. This is our house, she said. She'd drawn a house with 4 windows and a red door and 2 people standing out front. Just 2. I looked at it, and I thought about all the ways a family can break and all the ways it can reassemble itself into something that still holds, something still real, even if it's a different shape than what you started with. It looks just like it, I said. She nodded, very serious, and went back to coloring. I don't have a tidy lesson to give you at the end of this. I'm not going to tell you that everything happens for a reason, because I don't believe that. I'm going to tell you that I had 11 years with a woman I genuinely loved, that we made 2 remarkable kids, and that those things are real regardless of how the story ended. I'm also going to tell you that the hardest part of being betrayed isn't the moment you find out. The hardest part is the weeks afterward, when you still love the person, and you're also watching very clearly, maybe for the first time, exactly who they are. Love and clarity don't always arrive together. Sometimes one of them shows up years after the other. Sometimes clarity arrives in a restaurant hallway while your wife's hand is on another man's arm. And when it does, you have a choice about what to do with it. I chose to be steady. I chose to protect my kids and protect my dignity and handle things with documentation and legal counsel instead of a screaming match in the kitchen. I'm not saying that's the only right way. I'm saying it was right for me and for Owen and for Claire, and that when I look in the mirror now, I can see clearly. That's enough. Patrick Hale, for whatever it's worth, ended things with Diane within 3 months of the divorce filing. I heard that from Gerald, who heard it from the partner whose brother-in-law he was. Diane called me once, around that time, ostensibly about a pickup schedule for the kids. At the end of the call, she got quiet and said, "You handled this better than I deserved." I told her we should both just focus on the kids. She agreed. That's the whole story. I'm in my 40s now, and I live in the same house in Westerville. And Owen asks me questions I still can't fully answer. And Claire draws pictures of our house with 2 people out front. Some mornings I make too much coffee and the quiet doesn't bother me anymore. The ring is in a box in the closet. I haven't decided what to do with it yet. Maybe I'll give it to Owen someday if he wants it, if the metal of it means something different to him than it does to me. Maybe it won't mean anything to anyone, but I'm still standing, and I'm finally free to figure out what that means. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in some abstract way. In the very concrete, grounded way that my work as an engineer trained me to think. Every structure either holds or it doesn't, and when it fails, there is always a reason. Always a sequence. Always a point where the load exceeded what the foundation was designed to carry. What I went through with my wife didn't happen because of bad luck or fate or some invisible force deciding it was my turn to suffer. It happened because of choices. Hers. And in some smaller ways, mine. She chose repeatedly, over 8 months, to protect a lie instead of a marriage. And I chose, for too long, to measure everything against the warm moments and ignore what the cracks were telling me. Neither of those choices came without consequences. That's just how it works. Here's what I learned about integrity. It's not something you perform when things are easy. It's the thing that either exists inside you or it doesn't, and you find out which one is true when the situation gets hard. I could have blown everything up in that restaurant. I could have made a scene, caused damage, said things I couldn't take back. There was a version of that night where I walked across that room and did something I would have regretted for the rest of my life. I chose not to. Not because I wasn't angry. I was, but because I understood, even in that moment, that my children were going to be watching me handle this for years. Owen and Claire deserved a father who showed them that you can be hurt and still be decent, that you can be wronged and still be measured. There's something important about choosing intelligence over impulse. The most powerful thing I did in this entire situation wasn't confronting my wife at the dinner. It wasn't the divorce filing or the legal strategy or any of the external moves. It was the 2 months I spent quietly, carefully, gathering myself before I acted. Knowing something and choosing the right moment to address it. That is a form of strength most people don't talk about, because it doesn't look dramatic from the outside. But it protected my kids. It protected my financial stability. It protected my dignity. And dignity, once you lose it in a moment of rage, is very hard to get back. The hardest thing I want to say is this. Resilience is not about being unbreakable. I was not unbreakable. There were nights after Diane left when I sat in a house that was too quiet and felt the full weight of 11 years coming apart. I let myself feel it. I didn't perform being fine. But I kept getting up in the morning. I kept making breakfast. I kept showing up for Owen's baseball practice and Claire's bedtime stories. Because those 2 kids needed a parent who was still present, still steady, still there. That's what resilience actually looks like. Not the absence of pain, but the decision, made again and again, to keep going anyway. I'm not angry at Diane anymore. That surprised me. I thought the anger would stay longer. But what I've found on the other side of all this is something quieter and more solid than anger. It's clarity. It's the knowledge that I handled something genuinely hard with as much honesty and care as I could manage. And every morning when I look at those 2 kids sitting at my kitchen table, I know exactly what I was protecting. That's what I'd want anyone going through something like this to hold on to. Not the betrayal. The choice about who you're going to be because of it.